There were 24 candles burning in the great chandelier of the yellow drawing room at Wexbourne House on the evening of the 9th of February, 1818, and the Duchess of Wexbourne, who had ordered them lit herself because the housekeeper had been told by somebody else to use only 16, stood beneath them in a gown of plain white muslin with a single band of gray ribbon under the bosom, and counted the chairs. She counted them twice, as she counted everything twice, and found 40, which was correct, and then walked the length of the room and set 2 of them an inch further apart, because the space between them had been unequal, and nobody in that house had ever known her to leave a thing unequal when it lay within her hand to make it true. Her name was Adela, and she had been born Adela Farrand in a tall grey house on Queen Square in Bristol, the only child of Josiah Farrand, who had begun life keeping the books of a cotton mill in which he had no share, and had ended it owning 3 of them and a bank besides, and she had been the Duchess of Wexbourne for 4 years and 4 months, which was long enough for the servants to have stopped looking at her when she came into a room, and long enough for her husband to have stopped looking at her anywhere at all. She was 26. She had a still, pale, oval face that gave nothing away, and had been trained since childhood to give nothing away. Dark hair parted plainly in the center and pinned low, and gray eyes that people who did not know her called cold, and people who did know her, of whom there were perhaps 4 alive, called attentive. She wore no jewels. There was a case of them upstairs, the Wexbourne rubies and the pearls that had come down through 5 duchesses, and a diamond collar that had been made for the 3rd Duke's wife in 1762, and she had worn them exactly once at her wedding, and had felt them at her throat all that day like a hand, and had never taken them out again. It was said in the household that she did not wear them because she did not know how to wear them, being what she was, and she had heard that said more than once through a door left carelessly ajar, and had never troubled to correct it, because it was not the sort of thing that could be corrected by speech. The house on Hanover Square was very fine. It had been built in 1741 and refaced in 1790, and it had a staircase of Portland stone that turned twice upon itself under a painted ceiling of gods and clouds, and a library on the first floor with 11,000 volumes in it, of which the Duke had read, by his own cheerful admission, perhaps 40. The plate was famous. The cellar was famous. The debts, though fewer people spoke of them now than had spoken of them 5 years since, had been more famous than either, and it was on account of those debts that Adela Farrand had come to be standing under 24 candles in a muslin gown counting chairs, for the 7th Duke of Wexbourne had married her, in the October of 1813, for £80,000. Nobody had pretended otherwise. Her father had not pretended otherwise. He had sat in the small parlor at Queen Square, with his spectacles pushed up on his forehead, and said to her, in the flat Bristol voice he never lost, that the man wanted her money, and that she must decide for herself whether she wanted the man, and that if she did decide it, he would see to it that the money was tied so tight about her that no duke living could shake a shilling of it loose without her hand upon the paper. And she had decided it. That was the part nobody afterwards believed, and the part she never explained. She had met Julian Crail 3 times before he made his offer, and on the 3rd of those occasions, at a subscription concert in the Assembly Rooms at Bath, he had turned to her in the interval and asked her, quite seriously, what she thought of the second movement, and had then listened to her answer, all of it to the end, without once looking over her shoulder to see who else was in the room. It was not much on which to build 4 years. She had known at the time that it was not much. But she had been 22, and motherless since she was 9. and had spent her girlhood in a counting house learning her father's trade at a standing desk, because there was no son to learn it, and no man in Bristol or out of it had ever before asked her a question, and waited for the whole of the answer. And so she had said yes, and had signed the settlement on the 12th of October, 1813, in a room in Gray's Inn with 2 clerks and her father's solicitor at her elbow, and had understood every clause of it, including the ones that nobody expected her to understand, which was a circumstance that would matter a great deal more than 4 years afterwards than it did that morning. The Duke came down at 7:30. She heard him on the stairs before she saw him, because he came downstairs the way he did everything, quickly and lightly and without any particular attention, and he came into the yellow drawing-room with his cravat perfect and his dark hair swept forward in the way that his valet spent 40 minutes each evening arranging to look as though nobody had arranged it. And he was. There was no denying it, and Adela had long since given up denying it. One of the handsomest men in England. He was 34. He had a wide, easy mouth that seemed always on the point of some amusement, and blue eyes with a fine web of lines at their corners from a life spent out of doors on horseback, and he moved through a room the way water moves through a channel, without effort, and without leaving anything behind him. He glanced at the chairs, he glanced at the chandelier, and remarked that it was very bright, in a tone that was neither approval nor complaint, but simply an observation upon the weather of his own house. And then he said, without turning his head, "You will sit at the far end tonight. Bertram has brought the bishop, and the bishop is deaf on the left, so I have put him by me." "Yes," said Adela, "and the Varel will come at 9 after the dinner with the Lisburn party. It is only cards. You need not do anything about her." "No," said Adela. "You are very good," he said, and he said it kindly, which was the thing about him that had taken her 4 years to understand. He was not a cruel man in the ordinary way of cruelty. He was worse than a cruel man. He was a man to whom certain other people were simply not present, and who could therefore be perfectly kind to them as one is kind to a good chair, without any of it costing him anything at all. She went down to the far end of the table at 8. The dinner was for 40, and it was, though only 9 or 10 people at it knew this, a dinner about money. Lord Bertram Crail, the Duke's uncle, had come up from Kent, and the Bishop of Elverton had come with him, and the 2 of them together with Sir Wilfrid Chase and old Mr. Danby of the Board of Agriculture made up the party that was to sit the following morning in the library at 10 o'clock and put its name to the sale of the Aldermore timber. 4,300 oaks. Adela knew the number because she had counted them herself, in a manner of speaking, out of the surveys of 1794 and 1806. She knew that they stood on the clay ridge above the Aldermore brooks, and that they had been standing there, most of them, since before the house was built. And she knew, which nobody else in the room appeared to know, or to have thought it worth knowing, that they were the only thing holding the ridge, and that if you cut them, the brooks would silt within 3 winters, and 11 farms would go under water. She had said so. She had said so twice, once in September to the Duke directly, and once in November in a letter of 3 pages to the Duke's man of business, Mr. Silas Carow. And she had received on the first occasion a smile and the observation that she must not fret herself about brooks, and on the second occasion a very civil reply of 4 lines regretting that her Grace had been troubled and assuring her that the matter was in hand. So she had stopped saying so, and had begun instead, in the December of 1816, 14 months before the night of the 24 candles, to do the other thing, the quiet thing, the thing her father had taught her to do at the standing desk in Bristol when she was 11 years old, and had wanted to know why a mill that sold more cloth every year had less money in it every year. Her father's method had been very simple, and it had never once failed him, and it consisted of this: you do not argue with a man about his figures. You get the figures. She had got them. She had got them slowly, over 14 months, in the way that a woman in that house could get anything, which was to say invisibly, and at the cost of a great deal of tedium, and by asking for things that no one thought worth refusing her. The estate ledgers of Aldermore, for the years 1813 to 1817, requested of the housekeeper for the purposes of correcting the household accounts, and returned punctually each Friday. The rentals and the arrears books which Mr. Caro's clerk sent up without a question, because a clerk sends up what is asked for by a duchess. The timber accounts, the receipts for drainage upon the Aldermore levels 1814 and 1815, the bills of Marsh and Sons of Winchester, her own marriage settlement, of which she had asked Mr. Ambrose Pell of Gray's Inn, her father's solicitor, and now her own, for an office copy in the March of 1817, and which had come down to her in a japanned box with 3 seals upon it, and had sat upon her writing table for 11 days before she opened it, because she had known, before she opened it, more or less what she was going to find, and had wanted to be quite certain that she was ready to have found it. The dinner went off very well. It always did. The Wexbourne cook was French, and the Wexbourne butler, Mr. Oram, had been butler there since before the 7th Duke was breached, and between the two of them a table of 40 could be got through 3 courses and a remove, without anybody being obliged to notice that the woman at the foot of it had not spoken for half an hour. Adela ate a little turbot and drank half a glass of hock, and answered the Bishop of Elverton's nephew, who sat upon her left, and was 22 and terrified, with such steady and unhurried kindness that the young man went home and told his mother that the Duchess of Wexbourne was not in the least what people said, and was informed by his mother that he had been taken in. At the other end of the table, her husband was telling the story about the mail coach and the bear, which she had heard 11 times, and which was, she was obliged to admit, extremely funny, and the whole table laughed, and Lord Bertram struck the cloth with the flat of his hand, and the bishop's deaf ear turned the wrong way, and he laughed a beat behind everyone else, and the candles shook a little in their sockets from the noise. Adela laughed too. She had a low, sudden laugh that surprised people, and the young nephew on her left saw it, and was so astonished that he forgot to be terrified for the rest of the evening. At 10:30 the ladies had been an hour in the drawing-room, and the Lisburn party had come, and with them, in crimson silk cut lower than any other woman in the room would have dared, and carrying it with the perfect indifference of a woman who has never in her life been wrong about a gown, came Lady Isolde Verrel. She was 28. She had been married at 18 to a Verrel who had left her a jointure of 900 a year and a house in Half Moon Street, and had then obligingly died of a chill at Naples. And she had spent the 10 years since making herself indispensable to a succession of men who could afford her. And she was, whatever else might be said, not a fool. She crossed the yellow drawing-room directly to the Duchess, and took both her hands and said how charmingly it was all arranged, and how she did admire a plain gown. There was so much less to go wrong with a plain gown, and Adela said that she was very glad Lady Isolde liked it, and meant it, in the sense that she was glad of any true thing anybody said in that house. And Lady Isolde looked at her for a moment with a small line between her brows, because she never could tell, with this one, whether the arrow had gone in. The card tables were set out in the long room, and the doors thrown back between it and the little octagon ante-room at the head of the stairs, where there was a japanned screen and 2 chairs, and a stand of hothouse narcissus that Adela had ordered up from Ferncross that morning, and it was a little after 11, with the whole company at cards and the noise of it running along the ceiling like water, that the Duchess of Wexbourne went into the octagon room to see whether the narcissus wanted moving out of the draught, and was still standing behind the screen with her hand on the edge of the stand when her husband came in from the other door with Lady Isolde Varel on his arm and shut it behind them. They did not see her. There is no mystery in it and nothing arranged. The screen stood across the corner as it had stood for 20 years, and she was behind it, and they were not looking, and the whole of the rest of her life turned upon the fact that she did not, in the first 2 seconds, make a sound. She had time to make a sound. She thought about it afterwards a great deal, lying awake, and she was always honest with herself, and she knew that she had had a second and a half in which she might have stepped out and said good evening and let them be a little confused and let the thing pass, and that she had not done it, and that she had not done it because some cold, small, clerkish part of her, the part that had stood at the desk in Bristol at 11 years old and been taught not to argue with a man about his figures but to get them, had said very quietly, "Stand still." She stood still. "It is done in the morning, then," said Lady Isolde. "The timber?" "The timber, and the rest of it." "It is done in the morning," said the Duke. His voice was easy and warm, and a little wine blurred at the edges. The voice of a man who has had a good dinner in his own house among people who are fond of him. Bertram signs, Chase signs, Danby signs because Bertram tells him to, and the Bishop signs because he wants the living at Aldermore for his nephew, and he shall have it. £22,000 for the Ridge Oaks and 11 for the Ferncross Farms, and by Lady Day I shall be a free man for the first time since I was 19 years of age. And Ferncross itself, said Lady Isolde. There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. Behind the screen, Adela Crail did not move her hand off the edge of the flower stand. Ferncross itself, said the Duke, is not sold. Ferncross itself is a very pretty house of 9 bedchambers with a south front and 40 acres of park and a trout stream, 11 miles from the Aldermore gates, and it is at present standing empty and shut up under Holland covers, and I mean it to be opened in June. Do you? Said Lady Isolde. I do. Your Duchess may have something to say to that. And her husband laughed. It was not a hard laugh. That was the thing that Adela never afterwards could make anybody understand. When she came to speak of it, which was twice in her life, it was not a hard laugh. It was an easy one. It was the same laugh he had given at the Bear and the mail coach. And it came out of him without the least effort or malice. The way the truth comes out of a man at 11 o'clock at night in his own house when he believes there is nobody in the room whose opinion of him could possibly signify. My Duchess, he said, will say nothing to that, because my Duchess does not say things. Isolde, you must understand the position. I am not married in the way you are thinking of. I bought a woman in the October of 13 for £80,000, and she was delivered, and she has been in the house ever since, and she has never once been anything but perfectly correct, and I have never once had the smallest difficulty with her. Because she is not a wife. She is furniture. She is a very good piece of furniture. She was made in Bristol by a man who understood his trade, and she was bought and paid for and set down where she was wanted, and she stands there. You do not consult the sideboard about the disposition of the plate. Julian, said Lady Isolde, and there was something in her voice, a half-second of something that Adela remembered afterwards and never entirely disliked her for. Oh, I am not unkind to her, he said. Ask anybody. Ask her. She has 400 a year in pin money, and the whole of the Bristol connection to write her long letters, and she may order what candles she likes. But she is not a person who wants things, Isolde. She is not made that way. She has no more notion of wanting a thing than that table has, and it is a piece of good fortune for us all, and in June you shall have Ferncross. And then he opened the door onto the noise of the card room, and the two of them went out through it, and the door swung to behind them, and the flame of the single candle in the octagon room leaned and stood up again. The Duchess of Wexbourne remained behind the japanned screen for 4 minutes. She knew that it was 4 minutes because there was a clock on the chimney-piece, and she looked at it when she began, and again when she stopped, and this was not composure. Or not only composure, it was the oldest habit she had, older than the marriage and older than grief, the habit of turning a thing into a number so that it could be held. Her hands were perfectly steady. That surprised her, and she looked at them for a while to be sure. What she felt was not what she had always supposed she would feel if such a moment ever came, and she had supposed it a great many times, in the small hours, over 4 years. She had expected to feel that she was falling. Instead, there was an enormous, level, almost silent sensation of arrival, as though she had been walking a long while in the dark toward a house whose light she was not sure of, and had now put out her hand and touched the door. Because he was wrong. That was the whole of it. Standing there in the flower, scented dark with the clock ticking, he was wrong, in a matter of fact. And being wrong in a matter of fact was the one form of error that Adela Farrand had been raised from the cradle to consider not a misfortune but a debt. He believed he had bought her. He had not. He had never at any moment owned a single thing that she had brought into that marriage. Nor, and here was the point upon which the next 6 months of 11 people's lives were going to turn. Had he for the last 2 years and 11 months owned a very great deal of what he believed he had brought into it himself. She had known that since the 6th of May, 1817, at about 4:15 in the afternoon, sitting at the writing table in her own dressing room, with the japanned box open in front of her and the office copy of her marriage settlement unfolded across the blotter, and she had done nothing about it for 9 months. Because a woman does not tear a house down around herself and 11 farms and 400 souls on account of a suspicion, or on account of loneliness, or on account of pride. She had waited for a reason. She had it now. She went up to her own rooms at midnight, and she did not ring for her maid. What she did instead was to take the japanned box out of the bottom of the press and set it on the writing table under the lamp and unfold once more the 4 skins of parchment that she had by then read, at a fair estimate, more than 60 times, and read them again, not because she had any doubt of what they said, but because she was about to act upon them, and she had been taught that you read the paper again before you act. The settlement of the 12th of October, 1813, between Josiah Farrand of the city of Bristol, banker, of the first part, Adela Farrand, spinster, of the second part, Julian Augustus Crail, Duke of Wexbourne, of the third part, and Ambrose Pell of Gray's Inn, gentlemen, and the said Josiah Farrand, trustees, of the fourth part. Recital, that the 6th Duke of Wexbourne had died in the January of that year owing the sum of £61,400, and that the estates were charged with it, and that the creditors were pressing. Consideration, the marriage, covenant, that the said Josiah Farrand should pay into the hands of the trustees the sum of £80,000, and that the trustees should discharge the said debts out of it. And then the clause upon which the whole thing hung, which had been drawn by a Bristol banker who trusted no man living, and engrossed by a Gray's Inn solicitor who had been told to make it tight, and consented to by a young duke of 29, who had wanted the money by Michaelmas and had let his own lawyers gallop through it, because he could not bring himself to attend to a page and a half of dry stuff about reconveyance. That the manor and mansion house of Ferncross in the county of Berks, and the manor and lands of Aldermore in the county of Hants, and the messuage and premises in Hanover Square in the parish of St. George, should be conveyed unto and to the use of the said trustees, their heirs and assigns, upon trust for the sole and separate use of the said Adela Farrand, her heirs and assigns forever, free from the debts, control, and engagements of her intended husband, provided always. And it was in this proviso that the 7th Duke of Wexbourne had drowned without ever knowing he was in the water, that if the said Duke should on or before the 25th day of March, 1815, repay to the trustees the said sum of £80,000 with interest at 4 in the 100. Then, and not otherwise, the trustees should reconvey the said estates to him, and the trust should be at an end. He had not repaid it. He had not repaid a farthing of it. He had never at any time, so far as Adela could discover from 4 years of household books and 5 years of estate accounts, so much as remembered that there was anything to repay. The debts had gone quiet. The creditors had gone away. The rents had come in as they had always come in, and Mr. Silas Carew had gone on, receiving them and rendering his accounts to his grace, as though his grace were the owner of every acre. Because Mr. Silas Carew had never read the settlement either, and because the world is very largely run by men who have not read the paper. Lady Day of 1815 had come and gone in the ordinary way. Nobody had marked it. The proviso had lapsed on that morning as quietly as frost goes off a window, and from that hour the manor of Ferncross and the manor of Aldermore and the house on Hanover Square, in which 40 people had that evening eaten turbot, had stood, in law, absolutely and indefeasibly vested in Ambrose Pell and Josiah Farrand upon trust for the sole and separate use of Adela Crail, born Farrand, free from the debts, control, and engagements of her husband. Her father had died in the August of 1816. That left Mr. Pell sole surviving trustee, and it left her, being of full age and absolutely entitled in possession, a woman who might direct her trustee to do whatever she pleased with 3 estates and their rents, and who might, if she chose, call upon the Duke of Wexbourne to account to her for every shilling of rent he had drawn out of them since the 25th of March, 1815, which sum she had computed, out of Carew's own rentals, at £29,640. She had computed it 11 times. It came out the same. It had taken her from the 6th of May, 1817, when she first understood what she was holding, until the 2nd of February, 1818, to decide what she meant to do with it, and the delay had not been fear. She had spent those 9 months doing 3 things. The first was that she had gone on with the ledgers, and had found, in the drainage accounts for the Aldermore levels for 1814 and 1815, and in the repairs to the 11 farms along the brooks, a pattern that she recognized the way a musician recognizes a wrong string. Bills of Marsh and Sons of Winchester rendered twice, in April and again in October, for the same lengths of the same ditches, under 2 different clerks' hands, £940 for the rebuilding of a barn at Prue Barrow's Holding. Which barn? On a Tuesday in the July of 1817, when Adela had driven out to Aldermore with the Duke's aunt to distribute blankets, she had seen with her own eyes standing exactly as it had stood in 1790. Black with age and sound as a bell and never rebuilt at all. £4,800 in 5 years at the least, and probably a good deal more, had gone out of the Aldermore accounts into a hole, and the whole had a name, and the name was signed at the foot of every one of those accounts in a small tidy hand. S. Caro. The second thing she had done was to write, in the November of 1817, a letter of 9 pages to Mr. Ambrose Pell of Gray's Inn, and to receive him twice in her own morning room upon the pretext of the Bristol Trust, and to watch that dry, spare 60-year-old man read her workings through his spectacles twice over, and then take them off and polish them for a very long time before he said, in the flat, unhurried voice of a person who has been the trustee of a great many things and has never once been surprised into raising it, Your Grace, I have been 14 months waiting for you to send for me. The third thing she had done between the 2nd of December and the 2nd of February was to have him draw and engross upon 4 skins and lodge in his own strong room at Gray's Inn against her word, a deed of separation. Not a petition, not a complaint, not a suit in the ecclesiastical court, not a bill in chancery with its 10 years and its ruin, a deed made between the Duchess of Wexbourne of the one part and the Duke of Wexbourne of the other, whereby they agreed to live separately, whereby she released him from all claim to maintenance whatsoever, which was the clause Mr. Pell had wanted to argue about and which she had refused to alter, because she wanted nothing from him, and she wanted every soul in England to see that she wanted nothing from him, and whereby, in the schedule appended, the trustee set out for the avoidance of all doubt the 3 estates that stood vested in the trust, together with an account of the rents and profits received therefrom by his Grace since Lady Day, 1815, and a covenant that the said sum should be repaid, or at her Grace's sole election forgiven, upon such terms as she should in writing declare. It wanted only 2 things. It wanted his hand, which he could be compelled to nothing about, and which she did not in the least require, since the estates were hers whether he signed or not, and since the deed's value lay not in his signature but in its being read, and it wanted a room with people in it. She sat for some while with her pen dry over the paper. Then she wrote 3 lines to Mr. Pell at his house in Bedford Row, and rang, and gave the note to the night footman with instructions that he was to go on foot at once and to wait for an answer, and that he was to say to nobody in that house where he had been. You will be at Hanover Square at 9:30 tomorrow morning with the deed and the schedule and the office copy of the settlement, and you will be shown up to the library at 10. Bring your clerk. A. Wexbourne. And then she went to bed, and slept, by her own account afterwards, better than she had slept in 4 years and 4 months. At 10 o'clock on the morning of the 10th of February, the library at Wexbourne House held 14 people. There was the Duke, at the head of the long table with the green baize cloth, in a coat of dark blue and a very good temper, because he had slept 5 hours and had come down to sign away 4,300 oaks and be a free man by Lady Day. There was Lord Bertram Crail, his uncle, 61, gouty, honest in his fashion, and slow, with his spectacles already out. There was the Bishop of Elverton, and the bishop's nephew, who had been brought to see how business was done. There was Sir Wilfrid Chase, who was buying the timber, and Sir Wilfrid's own attorney, a sharp small man from Winchester named Follett. There was old Mr. Danby of the Board of Agriculture, asleep. There was the Duke's aunt, Lady Augusta Crail, 63, upright as a fire iron in grey silk, who had not been invited and had come in anyway and sat down by the window with her work-bag, as she had been doing in that room since 1779. There was Mr. Silas Caro, the Duke's man of business, 42, high-colored, dressed a shade above his station in a snuff-brown coat with a heavy gold watch chain, with his papers squared before him and his pen already mended. There were 2 clerks. There was Mr. Oram at the door. And at 9 minutes past 10, when Caro had begun to read out the heads of the agreement, the door opened and the Duchess of Wexbourne came in the same white muslin she had worn the night before, with a gray shawl over it, followed by a dry, spare, elderly gentleman in black, with a japanned box under one arm and a clerk behind him carrying a second box with both hands. Every man at that table rose, because she was a duchess. Her husband rose last and least, and said, pleasantly, Adela, "We are at business here." "Yes," said Adela, "I know what the business is. That is why I have come." And she walked the length of the room, and she did not sit down at the foot of the table where a chair had been half pulled out for her, but went past it, past Caro, past her husband, and stood at the head of the table with her hands folded in front of her, and said, in a voice that was not loud and did not shake and reach the far wall, "Mr. Caro, you may put down your pen. You are about to sell timber that does not belong to the person selling it, to a gentleman who cannot get a title to it, upon land that has not been his grace's these 3 years. Mr. Pell, be so good as to read the schedule. There is a particular quality of silence that comes into a room full of comfortable men when something happens for which none of them has a form of words. It is not shock. It is arithmetic. Every man there was privately and rapidly attempting to make what she had said mean something harmless, and every man there was failing. And the failing took about 4 seconds. And in the 4th second, Sir Wilfrid Chase's attorney, Mr. Follett, who was the only person present with nothing whatever to lose, sat forward very slightly and looked at the japanned box with the naked interest of a terrier at a hedge. "Adela," said the Duke, "sit down." "Mr. Pell," said Adela. Mr. Ambrose Pell of Gray's Inn set his box upon the green baize and unlocked it, and drew out 4 skins of parchment folded in 3 with a ribbon and a seal, and put on his spectacles, and read. He read the way such men read, without expression and without haste, and afterwards nobody in that room could ever remember his face at all. Only the voice going steadily on, and the sound of the fire and the slow understanding coming up the table like water coming up a cellar stair. He read the recital of the settlement of the 12th of October, 1813. He read the sum of £80,000 paid by Josiah Farrand, banker, deceased, and the discharge of the £61,400 of the late Duke's debts. He read the conveyance to the trustees of the Manor and Mansion House of Ferncross in the county of Berks, of the manor and lands of Aldermore in the county of Hants, 4,312 acres, together with the ridge woods thereon, and of the messuage and premises in Hanover Square, in the parish of St. George, Hanover Square, in the county of Middlesex, in which the 14 of them were at that moment sitting. He read the words upon trust for the sole and separate use of the said Adela Farrand, her heirs and assigns forever, free from the debts, control, and engagements of her intended husband. And then he read the proviso for reconveyance on or before the 25th day of March, 1815, and he stopped, and looked up over his spectacles, and said, the condition was not performed. No part of the said sum was ever tendered or paid. The estate of the trust therefore became absolute upon that day, and has so continued for 2 years, 10 months, and 16 days. Lord Bertram Crail said, "That cannot be right." "It is upon the roll, my lord," said Mr. Pell. "It was enrolled in Chancery in the November of 1813, and it may be read there by anyone this afternoon for a fee of 2 shillings. Nobody moved. Old Mr. Danby had woken up. By the window, Lady Augusta Crail had stopped sewing and had laid her work down in her lap and was looking at the Duchess of Wexbourne with an expression that her nephew, if he had turned round, would have found extremely difficult to bear. "There is a schedule," said Adela. "Read the schedule, Mr. Pell." He read the schedule. 3 estates, with their rentals: Ferncross, £810 a year; the Hanover Square house, at a rack rent of £900; Aldermore, £4,160 a year and rising, and then the account of the rents and profits received by His Grace out of the 3 since Lady Day, 1815, set out year by year in a column, and cast at the foot in Mr. Pell's own hand, £29,640. "The trustee does not at present demand it," said Adela. "I say at present." Then she took the last skin from Mr. Pell's hand herself, and laid it on the green baize in front of her husband, and turned it round so that it faced him, and put one finger upon the docket at the top of it. "This," she said, "is a deed of separation. It is drawn between us. It provides that from the date of it we live separately, that you are wholly and forever released from any claim of mine to maintenance, to allowance, to pin money, to jointure, or to a farthing of your money living or dead, and that I take nothing out of your house but what I brought into it. It provides nothing else, because there is nothing else that I want from you." She said that last quite evenly, and there was not a person in the room who did not hear it. "You need not sign it," she said. "I have not come to ask you for anything, and the 3 estates in that schedule are mine this morning, whether your hand is ever put to a paper or not. I have brought it to be read, and it has been read, before you, and before your uncle, and before a bishop, and before the gentleman who came here to buy my timber, and before Mr. Carow, so that no man in this house or out of it may ever say afterwards that he was not told." The Duke had not moved. He was looking at the parchment, and his face had gone a curious even color, and his right hand lay open on the baize beside it. "Adela," he said, "what is this?" "It is the paper," she said. "You do not consult the sideboard about the disposition of the plate. And that, and not the schedule, and not the £29,640, was the moment at which the Duke of Wexbourne understood what had happened to him, and he lifted his head and looked down the length of the green baize at his wife, with an expression of such absolute and undefended astonishment that Lady Augusta afterwards said it was the first honest face she had seen him wear since he was 9 years old. It was Mr. Follett who broke it, and he did it in the flattest professional voice imaginable, addressing himself not to the Duke and not to the Duchess, but to the middle distance, as attorneys do when they wish a thing on the record. "Sir Wilfrid," he said, "I must advise you that you cannot buy this timber. You cannot buy it today, and you cannot buy it in June. The vendor has no estate in the land, and no power to give you one. And if you paid your £22,000 across this table this morning, you would own precisely nothing, and would be suing in Chancery for it in 1826. Sir Wilfrid Chase, who was a large calm man who had made his money in Bristol himself and did not much mind who knew it, put his pen back into the standish and pushed the paper an inch away from him and said, "Then I shall not." "Wilfrid," said the Duke. "Julian," said Sir Wilfrid, not unkindly, "I have known you since you were at Eton, and I would take your word for £10,000 tomorrow. But I would not take it for 4,000 oaks that a lawyer has just told me are her Grace's, in front of a bishop." And then he turned in his chair to Adela and said, "Ma'am, will you sell me the Ridge Oaks?" "No," said Adela. "Why not?" "I will give you 23 for them." Because they are holding the ridge, she said, and if you cut them the clay will move, and the Aldermore brooks will silt within 3 winters, and 11 farms and about 400 people will be under water by the 4th. That is why they were not cut in 1794, and it is why they were not cut in 1806, and it is in the surveys, and I will show them to you this afternoon if you care to see them, and if you still want timber after that I have 200 acres of larch above the Ferncross farms that ought to come out this year, and I will sell you every stick of it at the market price. There was a silence of a different sort. Sir Wilfrid Chase looked at her for some seconds with his head slightly on one side, in the manner of a man revising an opinion he has held for 4 years, and then he said, "I will see the surveys at 3 o'clock, and picked up his hat. That was the first of them. Adela had not expected it and did not know what to do with it, and she found later that it was the moment out of the whole of that morning which she could not think about without her eyes stinging, which annoyed her considerably. Mr. Caro had said nothing at all. He had sat through the reading of the schedule with his high color draining out of him by degrees, like a room losing its fire, and he had gone on sitting there, with his tidy papers squared in front of him and his mended pen across them, and Adela, who had been waiting 11 months for the opportunity, and had promised herself she would not take it in temper, turned to him and took it. Mr. Caro, the trustee will require the Aldermore rentals and vouchers for the last 5 years to be delivered to Mr. Pell at Gray's Inn by Friday. Complete, including the drainage accounts for 1814 and 1815, and including the bills of Marsh and Sons of Winchester, both sets. His head came up on the words both sets. It was very slight, no more than an inch, and there were 11 other people in the room who did not notice it at all, and there were 2 who did, Mr. Ambrose Pell and Lady Augusta Crail by the window, who had been watching Silas Caro with quiet dislike since 1814 without ever having been able to give a reason for it that a man would accept. Her Grace shall have whatever she wishes, said Caro. His voice was almost steady. Though I must say, and I say it in His Grace's presence, and meaning no disrespect to any lady, that estate accounts are a very intricate business, and a person coming new to them will find a great deal in them that appears irregular and is perfectly regular, and I should be sorry to see Her Grace put to distress over a misunderstanding. So should I, said Adela, which is why I have read them 4 times. Then she said good morning to the room and walked out of it, and Mr. Pell and his clerk gathered up the parchment and the japanned boxes and followed her, and the door of the library shut behind the 3 of them, and she got halfway along the corridor to the stairs before her knees informed her, with some emphasis, of what she had just done. She put her hand flat on the wall by the tall window that looked into the square and stood there for a moment. Mr. Pell went past her at a decent distance and occupied himself for the space of perhaps 20 seconds in a searching examination of a portrait of the 4th Duke, and then remarked to the 4th Duke that in his experience the 5th minute after was the worst of it, and the 10th was tolerable. Thank you, said Adela. You are perfectly well, ma'am, said Mr. Pell. You have simply not been frightened for a long time, and you have got out of the way of it. She was laughing, unsteadily, when the library door opened again behind them, and her husband came out. He came out fast and stopped when he saw the solicitor, and Mr. Pell, with great civility, took his clerk and his boxes down the stairs and out of the house. So they were left alone in the corridor with the winter light coming in off the square, the Duke and Duchess of Wexbourne, at 20 minutes to 11 on the 10th of February, 1818, and Adela discovered that she had prepared over 9 months for every part of that morning except this one. You have been in that box a year, he said. 9 months. 9 months. And you said nothing. I said a great deal, said Adela. I said it in September about the Ridge Oaks. And I said it in November, in a letter of 3 pages to Mr. Caro. And I have said it at your own table upon, I think, 4 occasions in 2 years. I have never once been listened to in this house for the length of a sentence. So I stopped talking and got the figures instead. It is what my father did. It is the only thing I know how to do. The Duke put his hand up and pressed the heel of it against his forehead, hard, and held it there. Adela, what you heard last night. Yes, she said. Isolde Varel is nothing to me. She has never been anything to me. I know that, said Adela, and she said it with such complete and unbothered certainty that he took his hand down and stared at her. Do you imagine I care about Lady Isolde? She is the least interesting fact in this house. She is a clever woman with 900 a year who has to live somehow, and if she had been born with your income, she would have run 3 counties, and I have no more quarrel with her than I have with the weather. Then what? Said the Duke. Then what, in God's name? You said I was furniture, said Adela. I said it in wine, at 11 o'clock at night, to a woman I was showing off to like a boy of 19. Yes, she said. That is when men say what they think. She turned to go up the stairs, and then stopped with her hand on the rail, and said the thing that she had not planned and that she thought about, afterwards, more than any other part of it. You are not being punished for saying it. You are wrong about that too. If you had merely said it, I should have gone on as I was. Women go on as they are. It is the whole art of us. You are being answered because you were about to cut 4,300 oaks off a clay ridge and drown 11 farms to be quit of your debts by Lady Day, and because Silas Caro has had somewhere above 4,800 pounds out of the Aldermore drains in 5 years, and nobody has ever looked, and because if I sat still one more season, there would have been nothing left of that estate to save. The rest of it, what you said, what you think of me, whether you look at me across a table, is between you and yourself, and it is not worth a morning's work. But the ridge is worth it. The brooks are worth it. Prue Barrow's barn, that you paid £940 to rebuild in 1815, and which has never been rebuilt, and which I have stood in, is worth it. £940, said the Duke slowly. There is a good deal of it, said Adela. I shall send you the whole account when it is finished. You may look at it or not, as you like. It is your own name at the top of every page of it. And she went up the stairs. Behind her, in the corridor, the 7th Duke of Wexbourne stood by the tall window in the winter light for 11 minutes without moving, which was, though nobody counted it, and he certainly did not, the longest he had held still in that house in his adult life. News of a certain kind moves through a great house faster than it moves through a village, and it moves downward. By noon, Mr. Orme the butler knew. By 12:30, Mrs. Tabitha Nunn, the housekeeper, knew, and had gone into her own room and shut the door and sat down, and by 1 o'clock the news had reached the scullery, where a girl of 15 from Somerset, who had been in the house 9 weeks, was informed by the second footman, with the air of a man delivering a riddle, that the house did not belong to his grace, and never had, and that they all of them worked for the quiet one. The effect of it was not what a novel would have made of it. There was no cheering, and there were no speeches. What happened was very small and entirely unmistakable, and it began at 1:10 when Mrs. Nunn came up to the Duchess's morning room with the household book under her arm, as she had come up every Thursday for 4 years, and instead of laying it on the table and standing with her hands folded to be told that everything was very satisfactory, she opened it and turned it round, and said, "Ma'am, I should like you to look at the coals. I have thought for 2 years we are being cheated on the coals, and I have never liked to say." Adela looked at the coals. They were being cheated on the coals. It took her 40 minutes, and it saved the house £160 a year, and it was the first piece of business ever transacted in that room, and both women knew it, and neither said so. At 3 o'clock Sir Wilfrid Chase came and was shown into the small library, where the surveys of 1794 and 1806 were laid out for him, with the contour of the clay ridge marked in her own hand, and he stayed 2 hours and 20 minutes. And at the end of it he said that he had been buying and selling timber for 19 years and had never in his life had it explained to him by anybody who understood the ground under it. And he bought the Ferncross larch at the market price and shook her hand like a man. At 4, Lady Isolde Varel's carriage stopped at the door. She had come to leave a card, as she had left a card 3 times a week that winter, and she had come, in fact, to find out. And the Duchess of Wexbourne, who had thought about it and decided that a thing not done cleanly must be done twice, had her shown up. They looked at one another across the yellow drawing-room where the 24 candles had burned the night before, and where the chairs still stood at their equal distances. "You were behind the screen," said Lady Isolde. "Yes, I did not know it." "I am aware," said Adela. "You would not have let him go on." "That is not my business, but I noticed it, and I am telling you because you will spend a good while wondering whether I noticed it, and I would rather you did not waste the time." Lady Isolde sat down rather suddenly on one of the equal chairs. "Ferncross," said Adela, "is a manor and mansion house of 9 bedchambers, with a south front and 40 acres of park and a trout stream in the county of Berkshire, and it has stood vested in my trustee for my sole and separate use since Lady Day, 1815. It was never his to open in June, and it is not his to give. I tell you that plainly, and without any pleasure in it, because you were promised something by a man who did not own it, and in my opinion a person ought to be told when that has happened to them." There was a long pause. "You are not what they say you are," said Lady Isolde Varel at last. "No," said Adela, "very few people are. What will you do to him?" "Nothing whatever," said Adela. "He is not the thing that wants doing. There are 11 farms in Hampshire that want doing." Lady Isolde stood up. She was a woman of great social competence, and she used every ounce of it in the next 4 seconds, arranging her face, her gloves, and her position in the world, and then she abandoned all 3 and said, "I am 29 in April, and I have 900 a year, and I have been very frightened for 10 years. "I know," said Adela. "If you find in a year or 2 that you want an occupation rather than an establishment, write to me. I shall have a great deal to do and almost nobody to do it with, and you know more about how the world is managed than any man I have met." Lady Isolde Varel looked at her for a moment, and then laughed once, and it was a real laugh and not a drawing-room one, and she went down the stairs and got into her carriage, and she did not come back to Hanover Square that season. And 18 months later, at Aldermore, in a plain dark gown with her hair dressed lower than she had worn it in 10 years, she took charge of a subscription for a school and made 3 counties pay for it, and became, to the astonishment of everybody including herself, respectable. The Duke dined out that evening. He came home at 1:30 in the morning entirely sober, which his valet reported below stairs as the most alarming symptom yet, and the following day he did a thing that nobody in that house had ever known him to do. He sent up a note, on paper, from the library to the morning room, asking whether the Duchess would receive him at 11. She wrote back the single word yes. He came in at 11 exactly. He had not slept much. He stood in the middle of the room, and did not sit down, and said, I have been through the settlement with Bertram, and with my own man, and with a king's counsel at Lincoln's Inn, who took 2 hours over it, and charged me 11 guineas to tell me that it is as tight a piece of drafting as he has seen in 30 years, and that I have no case of any kind whatever. Ferncross is yours. Aldermore is yours. This house is yours. I am, as of Lady Day 1815, a tenant at will in the house I was born in, and I have drawn 29,640 pounds of your rents and spent every farthing of it, most of it stupidly. Yes, said Adela. You said the trustee does not at present demand it. The trustee does not at present demand it. Why not? Because I have not decided, said Adela, and because I do not make decisions of 30,000 pounds inside a fortnight, and neither did my father, and neither will you if you ever come to have 30,000 pounds again. He took that. Standing the way a man takes a blow he has decided in advance not to answer. What are your terms? He said. I have none. I have a deed, and it wants nothing from you. That is what you cannot make it fit, and you will go on trying for some weeks. You keep looking for the demand. Everybody has a demand. I have 3 estates, an income of 5,800 a year, a trustee of 60 years standing, and no children, said Adela. There is nothing left in the world that I need to ask you for. It is a very strange sensation, and I do not recommend the road to it. Then what am I to do? Said the Duke of Wexbourne. And Adela Crail, who had prepared for 9 months and had not prepared for this, looked at him for rather a long time, and then said the thing that turned out, in the end, to have been the whole of the rest of the story. You have 60 days, she said, not to persuade me of anything. In 60 days the trustee will hold the Lady Day rent audit at Aldermore, and I shall go down and take possession, and there will be 140 tenants and cottagers in that barn, and every one of them will have to be told what has happened and who is now to be applied to. I would rather they were told with you standing in the room than behind your back. That is all. You need not come. If you do come, you will be asked nothing and given nothing, and you will hear a good deal about yourself that you have never heard, and at the end of it you will still be a tenant at will. 60 days. Come or do not come. She went down into Hampshire on the 26th of February with Mr. Pell, his clerk, 4 boxes of ledgers, and her maid Susan Broadley, and she saw Aldermore for the second time in her life. She had seen it once, in the July of 1817, on the blanket distributing expedition with Lady Augusta, and she had spent that visit being driven along the carriage road and shown the lake and given cold chicken on the terrace, and it had been explained to her, in the tone people use for explaining a picture, that the estate was one of the prettiest in the south of England and brought in above 4,000 a year. This time she came in from the other side, by the Winchester Road, and made the chaise stop at the top of the ridge, and got out, in a plain grey pelisse and stout boots, and walked. The ridge oaks stood along the crown of it for the better part of 1.5 miles, 4,312 of them by the count of 1806, and she walked in under them and put her hand on the wet grey bark of one, and stood there looking down the fall of the land while the coachman held the horses and thought his own thoughts. From the top of the ridge you could see the whole of it, the brooks running down southwest in 3 courses through the levels, the 11 farms strung along them with their smoke going up straight in the February air, the water meadows on either side with their carriers and their hatches, the roof of the great house among its trees 3 miles off, and the church tower at Aldermore Magna. It was, as she had been told, one of the prettiest estates in the south of England. It was also, as she saw within 20 minutes, and as nobody had told her at all, half drowned. The main carrier below Barrow's holding had silted so badly that the water had gone out of its channel and made a fen of 9 or 10 acres of what the survey called first-quality meadow. 2 of the 3 brook hatches were rotten off their pivots. The dikes along the lower ends had not been cleaned, at a guess, in 5 years, and the willow scrub had gone up out of them in thickets as high as a man, and the whole of the money that had been drawn from the tenants for the drainage of those levels, £4,800 and more of it, had been paid out upon paper to Marsh and Sons of Winchester for work that a woman with a survey and a pair of boots could see in a single February afternoon had never been done. She walked 4 miles that day. She went down to the barn at Prue Barrow's holding, the one that had been rebuilt in 1815 for £940, and she stood inside it and looked up at the tie beams, which were oak and adzed and had the carpenter's numerals cut into them in Roman figures and a date, 1691, and she said aloud to Mr. Pell, "Write it down, please. The date is upon the beam. Mrs. Prudence Barrow, widow, 54 years of age, tenant of 91 acres and 4 months behind with her rent, came out of her house with her sleeves rolled and stood at the barn door with her arms folded and asked what they wanted. She had buried a husband and 2 sons, and had been dunned by Silas Caro's clerk since Michaelmas, and she was not disposed to be pleasant to gentry. When it was explained to her who the lady was, she said, 'Ah,' in a tone which conveyed with great economy that a duchess in her barnyard was one further trouble in a life composed of them. And when Mr. Pell began, in his dry way, upon the trust and the schedule, she cut across him and said, 'Is the rent to be found, or is it not?' 'Not this quarter,' said Adela, 'nor the last 2. They are struck off.' 'Struck off,' said Mrs. Barrow. 'You will find it in writing at the audit. And in the spring the carrier below your ground will be dug out to its old depth, and the hatch replaced, and the 9 acres you have lost will be meadow again by the 2nd summer. That will be done at the estate's charge and not at yours, because you have already paid for it once, in the drainage rate of 1814 and again in 1815, and I have your receipts in a box in that carriage." There was a considerable silence in the barnyard. "Who are you?" said Prue Barrow at last, and it was not impertinence, it was a genuine question from a woman who could not place the thing in front of her in any category she possessed. "I am the person the land belongs to," said Adela, "and I did not know until 9 months ago, and I am very sorry it has been so long." She stayed a fortnight. She lodged not at the great house, which was shut and under covers and would have taken 4 days and 11 servants to open, but in 3 rooms at the Wexbourne Arms in Aldermore Magna, over the archway, with the noise of the yard under her window at 5 in the morning, and she was at the estate office at 8 and out on the land by 9, every day, wet or fine, with Mr. Pell's clerk carrying the survey and a lantern-jawed young man named Tom Ridd, who was 19 and the underkeeper's son and knew every ditch on the property, walking ahead to open the gates. By the end of the first week the parish had settled its opinion of her, and the opinion was cautious. By the end of the second week the opinion had changed, and it changed on account of a single circumstance that she never knew about until years afterwards. She had asked Tom Ridd, on the 4th day, standing in the wet at the bottom of the Longmead, what he thought was wrong with the hatch, and had then not spoken for 3 minutes while he told her, and had then written down what he said, in her book, with his name against it. He told his mother that evening. His mother told the blacksmith's wife, and there is no proclamation, no distribution of blankets, no charitable subscription in the history of the English countryside that has ever done a quarter of the work, done by the news that the new one writes down what a 19-year-old underkeeper's son says about a hatch. Mr. Hollis Fane of Ridge Farm, 420 acres, the largest and most respected tenant on the estate, and a man of 60, who had refused for 11 years to be pleasant to anybody from the house, came to the Wexbourne Arms on the 11th day and asked for her grace and was shown up, and sat down opposite her with his hat on his knee among the ledgers and said, "They tell me you are having the carriers out." Yes, they were dug in 1772 and again in 98. I have the dates from my father. Have you the depths? Said Adela. And Hollis Fane, who had come there prepared to be civil for a quarter of an hour and go away, took a folded paper out of the inside of his coat and put it on the table, and stayed 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was upon the strength of those 2 hours and 40 minutes, and upon a great deal else, that the Lady Day audit came to be what it was. But before Lady Day there was Mr. Silas Carow, and the business of Marsh and Sons of Winchester, and the 15 days between the 2nd and the 17th of March that Mr. Pell afterwards described, in the driest note of a long professional life, as the most interesting fortnight he had ever spent in a country town. The vouchers came up to Gray's Inn on the Friday, as required, and they were incomplete, as Adela had known they would be. The rentals were there, and the arrears books were there, and the general accounts were there. The drainage bundle for 1814 and 1815 was not, and in its place was a very civil letter from Mr. Carow, regretting that those particular papers had been left at the Aldermore office in the confusion of the removal, and undertaking to forward them without loss of time. Adela read the letter twice, and then said to Mr. Pell, "He is going to Winchester." "I should think he has been there already," said Mr. Pell. "Then we go on Monday." What they went to Winchester to find was very simple, and it was the same thing her father had found in the mill accounts when she was 11 years old, and it is always the same thing, the two ends of a piece of string. Marsh and Sons, timber merchants and contractors, of Colebrook Street, Winchester, had been paid by the Aldermore estate over 5 years, the sum of £4,860 for the cleaning of carriers and the repair of hatches on the Aldermore levels, and for the rebuilding of a barn at Barrow's Holding. That was one end. The other end was the firm's own ledger. Mr. Ephraim Marsh was 71, and had handed the business to his sons and sat in the back room of the Colebrook Street yard with a stove and a cat and his old day books, and he was, when Adela Crail was shown into him, in the middle of his dinner. She told him who she was, and he was not much impressed, having done business with 3 dukes and been paid promptly by none of them. She asked whether she might see the estate's account with the firm for the years 1814 and 1815. He said that his sons had those books. She asked whether he had his own day books for those years. He said that he had, and that they were of no use to anybody, and that he kept them because a man must keep something. She asked whether she might see them, and offered to pay him for the trouble. He looked at her for a while over his spectacles. "You're the one that's had the whole tale of it out at Aldermore," he said. "Yes, there was a gentleman here Wednesday about them books," said Mr. Ephraim Marsh. "Snuff brown coat and a gold chain. Wanted the ledger for 14. My son let him have a sight of it in the front office, and he sat with it above an hour. He put down his fork. He never asked for the day books. Nobody ever asks for the day books. The day books of Marsh and Sons for the years 1814 and 1815 were 3/4 volumes bound in sheepskin, and they recorded in the hand of a foreman named Tapp what men went where, on what day, with what tools, and what was carted. Adela and Mr. Pell and Mr. Pell's clerk sat with them in the back room in Colebrook Street from 11 in the morning until 6:30 at night, with the cat on the ledgers and Mr. Marsh contributing, from his chair by the stove, a running commentary of remarkable value. And what they found was this. In 1814, the firm had sent 9 men to the Aldermore levels in April for 11 days, and had cleaned 440 rods of carrier at the upper end above Ridge Farm, and had been paid £262, and the work had been done. In October of the same year, the firm had rendered no bill at all to the Aldermore estate, and had sent no men anywhere near it, being that month wholly employed upon a turnpike contract at Alresford, and yet in the Aldermore accounts, in Mr. Caro's tidy hand, under the date of the 22nd of October, 1814, there stood a payment of £262 to Marsh and Sons for the cleaning of 440 rods of carrier above Ridge Farm. The same trick in 1815, in June, and again in November. The same trick, at larger figures, 3 times more. And under the date of the 4th of September, 1815, a payment of £940 to Marsh and Sons for the taking down and rebuilding of a barn at Barrows Holding, against which Mr. Ephraim Marsh applied to, said only, and with some heat, that his firm had never taken down a barn in that parish in his life, that the Barrow barn was a 1691 barn with a queen post roof and the best bit of framing between there and Alton, and that he would like to know the name of the man who said he had pulled it down, so as to be sure never to employ him. £4,860 paid, £1,210 of actual work done, £3,650 over 5 years gone into the pocket of the man who wrote the accounts, out of a drainage rate levied upon 11 tenant farmers who had gone on paying it while their meadows drowned. Mr. Pell made 3 certified copies. Mr. Ephraim Marsh put his mark to a statement, and so did the foreman Tapp, who was found at a yard in Hyde Street, and who remembered the Alresford turnpike very well, because he had broken his wrist on it. And on the 17th of March, at 11 o'clock in the morning, in the estate office at Aldermore, with a fire lit and the door standing open, Mr. Silas Caro was asked to attend upon the trustee. There were 6 people in that room. There was Adela, at the side of the table, and not at the head of it, because she had determined that this was Mr. Pell's business, and would be done by the trustee in form. There was Mr. Pell. There was Sir Edmund Ray, of Ray Court, a magistrate of the county for 22 years, who had been asked to be present and had come out of curiosity and stayed out of something else. There was Mr. Hollis Fane of Ridge Farm and Mrs. Prudence Barrow of Barrows Holding, in their best clothes, as representing the tenants who had paid the rate. And there was the clerk, taking it down. It occupied 50 minutes. Mr. Caro began high, with a great deal about the intricacy of estate accounts and the impossibility of explaining them to persons unacquainted with business, and he addressed almost all of it to Sir Edmund Ray as one gentleman to another, and Mr. Pell let him run, and then laid the Aldermore account for the 22nd of October, 1814 on the table, and beside it the day book of Marsh and Sons for the same month, open at the Alresford turnpike, and asked him to be so good as to reconcile them. He could not. He tried, and it was not pleasant to watch, and Adela did not enjoy it, which surprised her. She had expected to enjoy it, and had prepared a small private admonition against enjoying it, and found she did not need it. At the 11th minute he changed his ground and said that the payments had been made upon his Grace's own direction, and that he had merely obeyed. Mr. Pell asked for the direction in writing. There was none. At the 29th minute he said that the money had gone into the estate after all, in other forms, and that it would be found in the general account if a person knew where to look. And Adela said, without raising her voice, "It is not in the general account. I have cast the general account for 5 years, and it is out by £3,651 and 4 shillings, and I can show you the 4 shillings. At the 40th minute Silas Carew stopped talking. Sir Edmund Ray, who had come out of curiosity, took off his hat, which he had been holding, and set it on the table and said, "Mr. Carew, you will not leave this parish tonight." What followed took 11 months, and is a dull story, as the law generally is. A recognizance, an indictment at the summer assizes at Winchester, a plea, and a sentence of transportation which was afterwards commuted, on account of his wife and 4 children, to 2 years in the county gaol, at which Adela, having been asked her wishes by the prosecuting solicitor, said that she had none, and that she wanted the £3,651 returned to the tenants who had paid it and did not care in the least what became of Mr. Carew. Rather more than 2,000 of it was recovered, out of a house at Alton and a holding in the funds. It was paid back to 11 farms in the June of 1819 in 11 separate sums, with a letter of account to each, and Mrs. Prudence Barrow's share of it was £281, and she came up to the great house to say that there had been a mistake, because nobody had ever given her money back before in her life, and she assumed it must be one. The Lady Day audit at Aldermore had been held in the great barn beside the estate office since before anybody's grandfather, on the 25th of March, or the first fine day after it, and it consisted of a long table at the upper end, the agent behind it with the rentals, the tenants coming up one at a time to pay and to be given a receipt and a glass of ale, and at 2 o'clock, a dinner of boiled beef for 140 people at trestles down the length of the floor. In the year 1818 it was held on the 25th, which was a Wednesday, and it was fine, and by 9:30 in the morning there was not a soul on that estate who was not coming. They came for the same reason that people come to anything, to see. There had been a duchess in a grey pelisse walking the levels with a lantern-jawed boy for a fortnight in February. There had been a man in a snuff-brown coat taken up before Sir Edmund Ray in the estate office in March, and the 2 shillings worth of it had gone round the parish in a day. There had been letters, 16 of them, in a clear round hand, sent out to every tenant on the estate over the trustee's signature and hers, stating in plain words, without a syllable of law in them, that the estate was vested in a trust for her Grace's separate use, that all rents and arrears were henceforward payable to the trustee and to nobody else, that the drainage rate was suspended for 2 years, and that the arrears of the Michaelmas and Christmas quarters were struck off entirely upon the 11 Brook farms in consideration of the monies taken from them for work that had never been done. 16 letters. It is a very small thing, and it cost £4 in postage, and it was, in the opinion of Mr. Hollis Fane, who had farmed under 3 agents and 2 dukes, the first time in his life that anybody in a great house had written to a tenant to tell him something before it happened rather than after. She went in at 10. She wore grey, and no jewels, and she had in front of her on the table the rentals, the arrears book, the survey of 1806, and a plain quarto notebook of her own, and beside her sat Mr. Ambrose Pell, and beside him his clerk, and beyond them Mr. Fane and Mrs. Barrow, and 2 others chosen by the tenants themselves, which had never been done before, and which caused more comment in 3 counties than the whole of the Carew business. And at 18 minutes past 10, with the barn full and the doors open onto the yard and the light coming in through the great cart entrance in a long slant of dust, a traveling chaise came into the yard, and the 7th Duke of Wexbourne got out of it. He had come alone. He had no servant with him but the postboy. He had ridden the last 2 stages outside for the air, and he was, when he came in under the cart entrance and stopped, hatless and unmistakable in a plain riding coat, more entirely at a loss than any person in that barn. 140 people turned round. Nobody said anything at all, which was itself a form of address, and a severe one. He looked up the length of the barn at the long table and his wife behind it, and Adela looked back at him for perhaps 3 seconds, and then said, quite clearly, "Good morning. There is a chair at the end there, and we are upon the 3rd name." And he went and sat on it. He sat there for 5 hours and 20 minutes. He was not asked a question, he was not offered a glass, and he was not once addressed from the table, and he heard, as she had told him in February that he would hear, a great deal about himself that he had never heard in his life. He heard Mrs. Prudence Barrow, standing up in front of 140 of her neighbors, say what it is to lose 9 acres of first-quality meadow a year at a time, and to be told at every audit that the drains had been done, and to pay the rate for the doing of them. He heard a man named Cobb from the lower end describe how his wife had died in a house whose thatch had been reported repaired in 1816. He heard the sums. He heard £3,651 and 4 shillings read out, and the 11 farms named, and the amount that each had paid in a rate for nothing. And he heard, twice, from men who did not know he was in the barn, and once from a man who did, the phrase that went through him like a splinter, and stayed there for the better part of a year, which was, it was never the agent, it was that nobody was looking. And then he heard his wife take the audit. That was the part nobody had prepared him for, because nobody could have. She sat there for 5 hours with 140 tenants coming up one at a time, and she knew of every single one of them, without being told, and without consulting a paper, what land they held, what the ground was, what the rent had been in 1810, what the arrears were and why, and what had happened to them in the last 5 years. And when a man came up whose ground she had not walked, she said so, and asked him to tell her, and wrote it in the quarto book with his name beside it. She refused 2 things, and granted 11, and every refusal was given with the reason, and the reasons were arithmetical and could be checked. She told them what would be done in the summer, in order with the dates: the main carrier below Barrows from the 2nd week of April, 60 men, the 3 hatches new hung by midsummer, the willow scrub out of the lower dikes before the hay, the ridge oaks not to be touched, then or ever, and the reason for that read out of the survey of 1794, so that every man in the barn understood, most of them for the first time, why the wood on the hill had anything to do with the water in the meadow. At 3:30 the boiled beef came in, and the barn ate, and the noise of it went up into the roof, and at some point in the middle of that, the Duke of Wexbourne, who had eaten nothing, got up from his chair at the end and walked out into the yard, and stood by the mounting block in the sun. Adela found him there 20 minutes later. "You did not have to stay," she said. "No," said the Duke. He was looking at the barn roof, at the queen post trusses of it, which were oak and adzed. "Adela, I want to ask you for something, and I know that I have no right to ask you for anything, and I have thought about it for 5 hours, and I am going to ask you anyway, and you may refuse, and I shall not raise it again. Ask, let me learn it," he said, "not manage it. I understand perfectly that it is not mine, and that I shall never manage a root of it again, and I find, which I did not expect, that I do not much mind. But I have sat in that barn all day and heard 400 people's living described in a language I do not speak, and I have discovered that I am 34 years of age and cannot read a rental. My father could not either. Nobody has ever thought it necessary. I am asking you to let me stand in the corner of the office in the summer while the drains are done, and be taught by whoever will teach me what a carrier is and what a hatch does and how a rate is levied and what it costs to dig a rod of ditch. That is the whole of it. I am not asking for the deed to be altered, and I am not asking to be forgiven, and I am not asking you to sit at dinner with me. Adela stood in the sun in the yard and looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Fane will teach you," she said. "You will do exactly as he says, and you will not use your title in that office. And if you are not there at 8 in the morning, he is instructed to begin without you. And you will keep a book. A book. Everybody on this estate keeps a book," said the Duchess of Wexbourne. "It is how we know what is true." The main carrier below Barrow's Holding was opened on the 9th of April with 62 men, and it took until the 28th of May, and it moved, by Mr. Fane's calculation, somewhere above 9,000 tons of black silt out of a channel that had been dug in 1772 and had not been touched since '98. The silt went on to the banks in a long steaming windrow half a mile long, and then, at Adela's direction, and against the advice of 2 farmers who came round entirely by August, it was spread upon the thin ground at the upper end of Cobb's, which had been sour for 20 years, and which carried, in the second season, the heaviest crop of oats on the estate. She lodged at the Wexbourne Arms until the middle of May, and then, because it was absurd to keep 3 rooms over an archway when she owned a house with 51 of them, she had the covers taken off 8 rooms at Aldermore and lived in those, and left the rest shut. And this was noticed, as everything was noticed, and did her more good in the county than any entertainment she could have given. The Duke took a bedroom and a small parlor in the agent's house by the estate office, which had stood empty since Carow, and he was in the office at 8 o'clock in the morning from the 10th of April, and he was there, with 3 days' exception for the assizes at Winchester, until the harvest was in. Nobody made it easy for him. Mr. Hollis Fane, who was 60 and had refused for 11 years to be pleasant to anybody from the house, taught him the way a man teaches a slow apprentice he has not chosen, which is to say, by handing him a spade. He learned what a rod of ditch costs to dig, in wages, in beer, in tools broken, and in the time of the horse that carts it away. Because he dug 11 rods of it himself in the 3rd week, and could not lift his arms on the Sunday. He learned what a hatch does, and why a fall of 2 inches in 100 yards is the difference between a meadow and a fen. He learned to cast a rental, badly at first and then adequately, and to read an arrears book, which is a document that tells you, if you know how, exactly which of your tenants has had a bad year and which has a sick wife and which is drinking. And he kept a book. It was a quarto notebook, bound in marbled paper, bought in Winchester for 2 and 9, and he wrote in it every evening, and by Michaelmas there were 3 of them, and one of them survives to this day in a deed box at Aldermore, and the first entry in it, under the date of the 10th of April, 1818, is 4 words long. I do not know. They did not, that whole summer, dine together above 9 times, and each of those 9 was in company. This was Adela's arrangement, and she held to it without any apparent difficulty and with a great deal of private difficulty. She had spent 4 years and 4 months being nothing in a house, and she found that she was not willing, at any price whatever, to go back into a room where she might be treated kindly and not seen, and she said so once to Lady Augusta Crail, who came down in June and stayed 6 weeks and told everybody in 3 counties what she thought about it. "You have him digging ditches," said Lady Augusta. "Mr. Fane has him digging ditches." "Adela, what do you want?" And Adela, who had by then been asked that question by 4 different people and had given 4 different evasions, put down the pen and gave the true answer, which she had not intended to give to anybody. "I want to be looked at," she said. "That is all. It is a very small thing, and I have wanted it since I was 9 years old, and I do not want it out of pity, and I do not want it because I have turned out to own 3 estates, and there is no way on earth to ask a man for it, because the asking spoils it. So I shall not ask. And if it does not come, I shall have the levels, and the school, and my own accounts, and that is a great deal more than most women get. And I shall not sulk." "You have been married to him 4 years, said Lady Augusta. 4 years and 4 months, and he has never once asked me a question and waited for the whole of the answer except one time in the assembly rooms at Bath in 1813 about the second movement of a concerto," said Adela. "And I built 4 years upon that, which was foolish, and I shall not build anything upon anything again until I have seen it stand through a winter. What the summer did to the estate can be given in figures, and Adela gave them, in the audit of that Michaelmas, in a printed statement of 4 pages which she caused to be sent to every tenant, and to Sir Edmund Ray, and to the Board of Agriculture, and to 3 newspapers, and which was the first published estate account in the county of Hampshire, and caused an amount of comment quite out of proportion to its interest. 9,000 tons of silt, 460 rods of carrier opened, 3 hatches new hung in oak, 1,240 rods of dike cleared of willow, 91 acres of drowned meadow recovered to hay, of which 34 were prue barrows. Total charge upon the estate, £2,918. Total charge upon the tenants, nothing. Rents received at Michaelmas 1818, £4,090 against a rental of 4,160, being an arrear of £70 upon 140 tenancies, where the arrear at Michaelmas 1817 had been 1,180. That last figure was the one that travelled. It travelled because it is the figure that every landowner in England understands in his stomach, and because it said, in a language that could not be argued with at any dinner table in the south of the country, that the drowned and dunned tenantry of Aldermore, given back their meadows, and let alone about a rate they had been robbed of, had paid up £98 in the 100 without a bailiff being sent to a single door. Old Mr. Danby of the Board of Agriculture, who had slept through the whole of the 10th of February, woke up sufficiently to write her a letter of 9 pages. Sir Edmund Ray read the statement twice, and then had his own agent in, and asked him some questions that his agent did not enjoy. And in the November of 1818, the Hampshire Chronicle, in the course of a leading article upon the improvement of the southern levels, referred in a single sentence to the works, lately carried out upon the Aldermore brooks under the direction of Her Grace, the Duchess of Wexbourne. And the Duke of Wexbourne read that sentence in the coffee room of an inn at Alton, and cut it out with a penknife, and put it in the front of the 3rd marbled notebook where it still is. London had, of course, been talking since February, and London's version was not the true one. The true one was too dull for a drawing room, a settlement, a proviso, a date in 1815, an agent, a ditch. What London had instead was a story about a duchess who had taken her husband's houses away from him because he had a mistress, and it was told with relish from Grosvenor Square to Bath all that spring. And in every version of it, Adela Crail was either a Bristol shopkeeper's daughter who had bought a coronet and turned upon the man who sold it to her, or a cold woman who had been shamed and had done a vulgar thing in a public room. There is no answering that sort of thing. She did not attempt to answer it. But in the October of 1818, something happened that could be answered, and had to be, and it came from the quarter that Mr. Pell had been watching all along. A bill was filed in Chancery. The plaintiff was a Mr. Reuben Gaunt, a bill discounter of Bedford Row, who had held 2 of the 6th Duke's bonds in 1813, and had been paid in full out of the £80,000, and who now alleged, upon information supplied to him by a person the bill did not name and everybody could, that the settlement of 1813 was a fraud upon creditors, that the conveyance to the trustees was voluntary and void, and that the 3 estates ought to be declared the Duke's and made liable. It was, said Mr. Pell, a thoroughly bad bill, and it would fail. And it would take 4 years to fail, and in the meanwhile a lease pendens would lie against the title of all 3 properties, and no timber could be sold, and no lease granted, and no mortgage raised for the drainage of anything, and the Aldermore works would stop where they stood in the spring. That was the whole object of it, and everybody concerned knew it. What Mr. Gaunt wanted was to be bought off. He intimated through his attorney with great delicacy, £4,000 and his costs, and he expected to have it within a month, because that is what always happens. Adela read the bill 3 times, and then went to Bedford Row herself. She did not take Mr. Pell, who advised strongly against it, nor a footman, and she went in a hackney coach, and she was shown up into a first-floor room that smelled of coal and paper. And Mr. Reuben Gaunt, who had never in 26 years had a duchess in his office, and had certainly never had one alone, offered her the good chair. "I am not going to argue the bill with you," said Adela. "You have an attorney, and I have a trustee, and they will do that at 4 guineas an hour for 4 years if we let them. I have come to tell you 2 things, and then I shall go. The first is that you will not be paid a shilling, not 4,000, not 400, not 4. There is no sum that I will pay you, and there is no sum that I will pay anybody who does this to me, ever, for the rest of my life, and I want you to understand that this is not temper. It is a rule, and it is the same rule my father kept in Bristol for 30 years, and it is the reason that in 30 years he was never once obliged to buy off anybody twice." Mr. Gaunt began to say something about the merits. "The second thing," said Adela, "is this. Your bill says the conveyance was voluntary and a fraud upon creditors. You were one of those creditors. You held 2 bonds of the late Duke, numbered in your own books, and you were paid in full, principal and interest, on the 4th of December, 1813, out of my father's £80,000, and you gave a receipt for it, and I have an examined copy of that receipt in this reticule, and here it is." She put it on the desk. Every creditor of that estate was paid in full, by name, out of the money that bought those 3 estates for me. There was no fraud upon creditors, because there were, after the 4th of December, 1813, no unpaid creditors to defraud. Your own bill is going to be answered with your own receipt, in open court, and the Lord Chancellor is going to ask your attorney what he means by it. And I am told by Mr. Pell that when a plaintiff has been paid in full and files such a bill notwithstanding, the court has a way of expressing itself about the attorney's conduct, which is remembered in the profession for a very long time. Mr. Reuben Gaunt looked at the examined copy of his own receipt for 1 minute and a half by the clock on his mantelpiece. "Who told you to file it?" said Adela. "I am not going to say." "No," she said, standing up. "I did not think you would, and I do not need it. There are 2 men in England with an interest in stopping those works, and one of them is in Winchester Gaol and cannot afford a shilling. So it is the other. And the other is a person who has been buying the Aldermore wool clip at 11% under the market for 9 years, and would very much like the estate to be a great deal poorer than it is about to be. I shall deal with him at Michaelmas. The bill was withdrawn on the 11th of November, 1818, and Mr. Gaunt paid his own costs, and Adela paid nothing. And the story of what had been said in the first floor room in Bedford Row got about the city of London in a fortnight, in a form very much more accurate than any version then current in the West End, with the result that from that winter onward the Duchess of Wexbourne was regarded in the city as a person one did not attempt, which was worth, over the following 10 years, a good deal more than £4,000. Society came round in the way society always comes round, which is suddenly and without apology and on account of an old woman. Lady Augusta Crail, 63, upright as a fire-iron, who had been going to the same 6 houses since 1779, and had never in her life explained herself, gave a dinner in Grosvenor Street in the January of 1819 for 24 people, and put her nephew's wife on her own right hand, and said, in the pause after the soup, in a voice audible to the entire table, "You will all have heard a great deal of nonsense this year, and you will have it from me now that the Wexbourne estates were settled upon my niece by her father in 1813 with the whole of my family's knowledge and consent, that every farthing of my brother's debts was paid out of her money, and that the only thing which has happened since is that she has read the accounts and my nephew did not. If any of you think a woman ought not to read accounts, you may say so now, and I shall be glad of the amusement." Nobody said so. Old Mr. Danby, who was present and awake, observed into the silence that he had lately read her Grace's statement of the Aldermore works, and thought it the best drawn estate account he had seen in 40 years upon the board, and that if the government had had the drainage of the Bedford level in such hands in 1801, it would have saved the country £1.5 million of money. And the conversation moved on to the price of wool, and the thing was over. It is quite as arbitrary as that, and everybody who has ever lived in the world knows it. He wrote to her that winter. It began in the December, when she was at Aldermore, and he was in London upon the business of the wool clip, and it began because there was something he needed to tell her about a contract, and it would not go into 3 lines, and the letter ran to 5 pages, and 4.5 of them were about wool. She answered it in 4 pages, all of them about wool. And then it went on, twice a week, from December to March, and it remained on the surface entirely about wool, and drainage, and the price of oak, and a proposal for a school, and underneath it, in the way of such things, something else was being said in every line of it by 2 people who had agreed without a word that neither of them would say it. She kept those letters. There are 61 of them in the deed box at Aldermore with the marbled notebooks, and they are taken as literature, the dullest bundle of paper in the county of Hampshire. And there is one of them, dated the 4th of February, 1819, in which the Duke of Wexbourne, having filled 3 pages with the comparative merits of a Tuckwell hatch and a common one, breaks off at the top of the 4th and writes, "I find I have been an hour over this, and it is 2 in the morning, and I am not sorry, because it is the only hour of the day in which I am not alone in the room." She read that sentence 11 times, standing at the window at Aldermore with the frost on the park, and then she put the letter in the box with the others and went out and looked at a ditch. The school was at Ferncross, and it was hers, and she opened it on the 1st of March, 1819, in the 3 rooms of the south front that had stood under Holland covers since 1815, waiting to be opened in June for somebody else. She had thought a good deal about whether that was a piece of spite. She decided in the end that it was not, or that it was only a very little, and that a house with 9 bedchambers and 40 acres and a trout stream and no inhabitants was an offense against the ordinary sense of things, whatever the history of it, and she put in a schoolmistress at £50 a year and a matron and 31 girls from the 11 Brook Farms and the Ferncross tenantry, and they were taught reading and writing and the 4 rules of arithmetic, and, from the 2nd year, bookkeeping by double entry, which was thought in the county to be an eccentricity and was in fact the entire point. The subscription for it was raised by Lady Isolde Varel, who wrote to Adela in the January, from Half Moon Street, a letter of 1 page and 11 lines that began, "You told me 18 months ago to write if I ever wanted an occupation rather than an establishment, and I have burnt 4 drafts of this." She came down in the February and stayed a week, and went round 3 counties in March, and got £290 out of people who had never given a shilling to anything, by methods that Adela did not inquire into, and the 2 of them, the plain one and the crimson one, were seen together in the same pew at Aldermore Magna on the 7th of March, 1819, which finished the London Story Stone dead, there being nothing whatever left of it to tell. And in the middle of March at Aldermore, in the estate office, with the door open and the noise of men in the yard, the thing that had not been said got said, and it was not said gracefully, and it took about 4 minutes. He had come in with the wool contract and a question about the Longmead hatch, and he had asked the question and had the answer, and then instead of going he stood there turning his hat in his hands like a tenant and said, "May I say something that is not business?" "Yes, I have been keeping a book since April," said the Duke. "You told me to. There is a page at the back of the first one that I have written on 4 times and crossed out 4 times, and I am going to say it now instead, badly, and then I shall go and see to the hatch." "Adela, I did not know you were behind the screen, and if I had known it I should not have said it, and that is the worst thing that can be said about me, and I have known it since about the middle of April. It was not that I was cruel to you in the drawing room and kind to you at breakfast. It is that I looked straight at you for 4 years and did not once see anybody there, and the reason I did not see anybody there is not that you were quiet. It is that you were not what I was going to get any use out of. So I stopped. I have done it to a great many people. I did it to Fane for 11 years, and he knew it, and that is why he handed me a spade. He turned the hat over again. I am not going to ask you to alter the deed. I want you to understand that I have never once wanted it altered. I have thought about it every day since February, and I would not have it altered if you offered. The estates are yours, and I hope to God they stay yours, because I have watched what has happened on that land in 1 year, and I know exactly what would have happened to it in mine. What I am asking is only whether at some time, when you can bear it, I might be allowed to ask you a question and wait for the whole of the answer. Beginning now, if you like. I have one. Adela put down the pen. Ask it. What did your father teach you, said the Duke of Wexbourne at the standing desk in Bristol, when you were 11, and the mill sold more cloth every year and had less money in it? I have wanted to know that since the 10th of February, and I have not had the right to ask. And she told him. It took an hour and 40 minutes, and it went from the mill accounts of 1803 to the 4 shillings in Caro's general account, and at some point in the middle of it, Mr. Fane came to the office door with a question about the hatch, and looked in and saw the 2 of them at the table with the ledgers open between them and the Duke of Wexbourne, bent over a column of figures with his chin in his hand and his hat forgotten on the floor, and Mr. Hollis Fane, who was 60 and had not been pleasant to anybody from the house in 12 years, went away again without knocking and dealt with the hatch himself. In the spring of 1819, the thing that had begun in a ditch below Barrow's Holding turned into an Act of Parliament, which is a sentence that would have astonished every person concerned 18 months before. The Aldermore brooks did not run only through Aldermore. They rose above the ridge on Sir Edmund Ray's land, and they went out at the bottom through the parishes of Ovington Sandys and Little Thrale and 4 other men's property, and the whole level had been governed since 1771 by a commission of sewers of 11 members that had met twice a year, achieved nothing, and quarreled continuously, because no one of the 11 could be made to spend a shilling upon a channel that would benefit the man below him. That is the eternal condition of every drained country in the world, and it is why so few countries are drained. What Adela proposed, in a printed paper of 11 pages circulated to the 11 commissioners at Christmas 1818, was that the whole level be put under a single new commission with power to levy one rate over the entire catchment, and to carry out the works in one order from the top down, beginning at the ridge and ending at the outfall, upon a schedule of 11 years, and that the schedule be published in advance, with the dates and the accounts published annually, so that every ratepayer on the level might see what he had paid for and whether it had been done. It required a private bill. A private bill required a petition, and evidence before a committee of the House of Lords, and it required the 11 commissioners not to fight it, and above all it required somebody to stand up in a committee room in Westminster and be asked questions for 2 days by counsel retained at 50 guineas by 2 landowners who did not want to pay a rate. Adela could not do that. She had put in her own paper, and she had cast every figure in it, and she knew the level better by then than any man alive, and she could not appear, because the estates were vested in a trustee, and the petitioner was the trustee, and because a duchess did not give evidence before a committee of the Lords in the year 1819, and because if she had attempted it, the newspapers would have made the bill about her, and it would have died in a week. She said all this to Mr. Pell in the February, very levelly, and Mr. Pell polished his spectacles for a long time, and said that in his opinion the person to give the evidence was the Duke. He is not the petitioner. He is a Duke, ma'am, and their lordships will listen to him for 4 minutes upon that account alone, and after 4 minutes they will listen to him or not entirely upon what he knows. And he does know it. I have examined him twice, and I could not shake him upon the fall of the Longmead, which I have been trying to understand for a year. So the 7th Duke of Wexbourne went before the committee on the 14th and 15th of June, 1819, in a room off the Painted Chamber, with the 3 marbled notebooks on the table in front of him, and a copy of the survey of 1794 rolled at his elbow, and was examined for 11 hours over 2 days by 2 of the ablest parliamentary counsel then practicing, and did not once lose his temper, and did not once say anything he had not walked over himself. He was asked what a carrier was. He told them, and then told them what it cost to open a rod of one, in wages and beer and horse hire, and where the money went, and he was asked how he came by the figure, and he said, because I dug 11 rods of it in April of last year, and I have the day's account in this book. He was asked whether the ridge oaks might not be felled to defray the rate, that being an obvious economy which their lordships would wish to consider, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said that 4,312 oaks stood upon a clay ridge above 11 farms, and that if they came down the ridge would move, and the brooks would silt within 3 winters, and 400 people would be under water by the 4th, and that he knew this because he had proposed to sell them himself, in the February of 1818 for £22,000, and had been stopped, and had spent the 15 months since learning why he had been wrong. The chairman of the committee, who had been half asleep, put down his pen at that. Stopped by whom? Your Grace, and in a committee room off the Painted Chamber, before 11 peers, 2 counsel, 4 clerks, 7 landowners, and the reporter of the Morning Chronicle, the Duke of Wexbourne said, "By my wife, my lord, the estates are hers, settled upon her by her father in 1813, and vested in her trustee for her separate use. And I hold no acre of them, and want none. The works upon the Aldermore levels were designed by her and paid for by her, and were carried out last summer under her direction. The paper before this committee is hers. I did not write a line of it, and I could not have written it 3 years ago, and I have been taught what I know by her tenants at her orders. If their lordships wish to be satisfied upon any figure in it, I can carry the question to her tonight and bring their lordships the answer in the morning, and I would advise them to ask, because in 11 hours of examination I have not yet been asked anything she did not tell me they would ask. There is no record of what the 11 peers thought. There is a record of what they did, which is that the Aldermore and Ovington Levels Bill passed the committee unamended on the 18th of June, 1819, and received the royal assent on the 12th of July, and there is a paragraph in the Morning Chronicle of the 17th, which the Duchess of Wexbourne read at breakfast at Aldermore, with the sun coming in off the park, and which she cut out with a paint knife herself, and which is in the deed box now, between a wool contract and a letter about a hatch. It is 4 lines long, and it names her twice. She had said in Bedford Row that she would deal with the other man at Michaelmas, and she dealt with him at Michaelmas, and it was the last piece of that whole business, and in some ways the most satisfying, because it was done entirely in public and entirely with arithmetic, and there was nothing in it that anybody could call revenge. The other man was Mr. Bartholomew Sleech, wool factor, of Andover, who had bought the Aldermore clip and the clips of the 11 Brook farms every year since 1810, always in July, always privately, always at his own price, and always a little under the market, and who had put a bill discounter in Bedford Row up to filing a bill in Chancery in the October of 1818, because a drained estate with recovered meadows was going to carry a great many more sheep, and a proprietor who published her accounts was going to find out, sooner or later, what wool was actually worth. She found out in the March of 1819. It took her 4 days and a subscription to 2 Yorkshire price currents, and the answer, set out in a column of 9 years, was that the Aldermore clip had been bought at an average of £11 in the 100 below the Winchester and Andover market of the same week in every year but one, and that the 11 Brook farms, selling their own smaller clips to the same gentleman in the same fortnight, had done rather worse. Over 9 years upon the estate and the tenants together, the difference came to £4,310. She did not write to Mr. Sleech. She wrote instead, on the 1st of April, to every one of the 11 Brook tenants, and to 9 of the neighboring farmers on the level who were not her tenants at all, and asked them to a meeting at the Wexbourne Arms upon the 2nd of May. And at that meeting, in a room over the archway, with 23 farmers in it, and a great deal of tobacco smoke, she put the 9-year column upon the table and let them read it, and then proposed the thing she had come to propose, which was that the whole of the level should sell its wool in one lot, by public auction, in the yard at Aldermore Magna, on a fixed day in July, with the buyers advertised against in the Hampshire and the Salisbury papers and in 2 Yorkshire ones, and the weights published. and the price got by every grower entered in a printed sheet afterwards so that every man could see what his neighbor had made. There was an hour and a half of argument, most of it from the 4 largest men present, who did very slightly better out of Mr. Sleech than the small ones did and understood exactly why. Mr. Hollis Fane, who was the largest of all of them, ended it. He stood up with his hat in his hand and said that he had sold to Sleech for 19 years and had known for at least 12 that he was being shaved, and had gone on doing it because the alternative was to be the one man in the parish who could not sell his clip, and that the whole beauty of what her grace had put on the table was that nobody would have to be that man, because they would all be in it together, and if they were all in it together, Sleech would have to bid in the open like anybody else, in front of the men he had been shaving. The auction was held on the 16th of July, 1819, in the yard at Aldermore Magna, with the wool stacked in the cart shed and weighed in front of the growers and the weights called out. 4 buyers came down, 2 from Andover, 1 from Salisbury, and 1 from Leeds, who had seen the advertisement in a Yorkshire paper and had never in his life bought a fleece south of Northampton. Mr. Bartholomew Sleech arrived at 11 in a gig and understood the position within about 90 seconds, and stood at the back of the shed with his hat on and bid, for the first time in 9 years, against another man's money. The whole clip of the level, 41,000 pounds weight of it, went to the Leeds buyer at 1 1/8 the pound, being 1 4 above the price Mr. Sleech had paid in the July before, and the difference over the estate and the 22 growers together was 3,190 pounds in a single morning. The printed sheet went out a fortnight later, with every grower's weight and price on it, and the smallest of them was a widow at the lower end, with 11 fleeces, and her name is on that sheet in the same type as the Duke of Wexbourne's, which was Adela's instruction to the printer and was not an accident. The auction has been held in that yard every July since, and it was held in July of last year. Mr. Sleech gave up the Andover house in 1822 and went into the coal trade. He is not otherwise interesting, and Adela, who was asked about him once at a dinner and expected to be witty, said only that he had done exactly what a man does when nobody is looking, and that the answer to it was not to be angry with him, but to arrange to be looking, and that this was the entire content of her father's religion, and the reason there was a bank in Bristol with his name on it, and that she had never in her life had an original idea of her own upon the subject. On the 10th of February, 1820, exactly 2 years to the day after the reading of the schedule, there were 14 people in the library at Wexbourne House in Hanover Square, and it was Adela who had called them. She had thought about that a good deal too, and had decided that a thing done in a room must be undone, or completed, in the same room with the same people in it, because that is how human beings actually settle anything. And so there was Lord Bertram Crail with his spectacles, and the Bishop of Elverton with his deaf ear turned the wrong way, and the bishop's nephew, 24 now and no longer terrified of anybody, and Sir Wilfrid Chase, who had bought 200 acres of Ferncross larch and come back the next year for more, and old Mr. Ganby of the Board of Agriculture, awake, and Lady Augusta Crail in grey silk by the window with her work-bag, and Sir Edmund Ray, and Mr. Hollis Fane of Ridge Farm in his good coat, and Mrs. Prudence Barrow in a new bonnet, and Lady Isolde Verrell with the school subscription book, and Mr. Ambrose Pell and his clerk, and Mr. Orham at the door. And there was the Duke at the foot of the table this time, because he had come in last and taken the chair nobody wanted, which was a thing Adela noticed and did not remark upon and thought about for a week afterwards. Mr. Pell read 2 instruments, The first was a deed of release and acknowledgment executed by the Duke of Wexbourne, whereby he acknowledged for himself and his heirs and for all time that the manor and mansion house of Ferncross, the manor and lands of Aldermore, and the Messuage in Hanover Square stood vested in the trustee for the sole and separate use of Adela, Duchess of Wexbourne, absolutely, released all claim, right, title, interest, and pretense of every kind in the said estates, and every equity of redemption under the proviso of 1813, and covenanted that he would not at any time hereafter, by himself or any person on his behalf, question, impeach, or delay the said trust. It was drawn as tight as the settlement, because Adela had told Mr. Pell to draw it that way, and the Duke, being shown the draft in the December, had returned it with a single line in the margin, make it tighter. The second instrument was 4 lines long, and had been engrossed that morning at his own charge. It was a receipt. It acknowledged that the sum of £29,640, being rents and profits received by him out of the trust estates between Lady Day 1815 and Lady Day 1818, had that day been discharged in full, in cash to the trustee. He had paid it. That was the part which no one in that room except Mr. Pell and Lady Augusta had known was coming, and it took Lord Bertram some seconds to work out how, and the answer was, by selling everything else he had in the world. He had sold the house in Melton and the 4 hunters and the shooting box in Argyll and the whole of the plate that was not entailed, and the pictures at his own personal disposition, which were 11 and included a quip. He had lived for 2 years in a bedroom and a small parlor in an agent's house on 1,100 a year, of which 400 had gone into the school subscription, and he had made up the last 3,000 of it by the sale, in the January of 1820, of the only asset remaining to him, which was the reversion of a small property in Kent that had come to him from his mother and had been meant for his eldest son. Adela had not known about the reversion until she saw the number. She sat quite still while Mr. Pell read the receipt, and she did not look down the table, and when it was finished she said, "The trustee acknowledges payment," in a voice which perhaps 4 people in the room understood was not steady, and one of them was Lady Isolde Verrel, who looked hard at the subscription book in her lap. Then Adela said, "I have one thing to add, and it will take a minute. 2 years ago I asked Mr. Pell to read a schedule in this room, and I said at the time that I did it so that no man should afterwards say he had not been told. I am going to be equally exact today. Nothing in the deed of separation is altered. It stands, word for word, and it will stand as long as I live. I release His Grace from all maintenance and all claim, and I take nothing from him living or dead, and the 3 estates are mine. He has asked me for no alteration, and I have offered none, and there will be none." She let that sit. "What I am going to do is this. From Lady Day the estate will require a resident commissioner for the works upon the level, at 400 a year, appointed by the trustee, to be answerable to me for every rod dug and every shilling spent, and to render his accounts quarterly in this room, and to be dismissed, without notice if they are wrong. I have offered the appointment, and it has been accepted. It is not a gift. There were 2 other men considered, and Mr. Fane will tell you what he thought of them. It is the only thing on this estate that I have ever known him ask for, and he asked for it in a letter of 2 pages that was entirely about the fall of a ditch, and had 1 sentence at the end of it, which I shall not read out." Lord Bertram Crail said, "Adela, are you telling us that my nephew is to be your servant?" "I am telling you," said Adela, "that he is to be paid 400 a year for work he can do, by the person who owns the land upon terms in writing, which is what every honest arrangement between two people looks like, and I cannot think why it should be thought remarkable. And then, because she had promised herself she would not do the whole of it in the language of business, and because Lady Augusta had said something to her in the passage that morning that she could not get out of her head, she looked down the length of the green baize for the first time that hour, and said, to the man at the foot of the table, "You asked me last March whether you might one day ask me a question and wait for the whole of the answer. You have asked me a great many since, and you have waited for every one, and I have counted them, because I count everything. Ask the other one." The 7th Duke of Wexbourne stood up at the wrong end of his own table, in front of a bishop, an aunt, 2 tenants, a magistrate, a timber merchant, and the woman who had raised £290 for a girls' school in 3 counties, and said, "Will you let me court my wife, not live with her, not be forgiven and not be trusted and not have anything back? I am asking to be allowed to call at Ferncross on a Sunday and be refused sometimes." "Yes," said Adela Crail, "you may call on Sundays. You will find me at the school until 4. He called on Sundays. He called on the first Sunday after Lady Day, 1820, and on 41 Sundays out of the 52 that followed, and he was refused on 9 of them, twice because she was genuinely engaged, and 7 times because she had said she would refuse sometimes, and she was a woman who kept her word even when it cost her an afternoon she wanted. He came on horseback, 11 miles from the agent's house at Aldermore, and he came in the morning and went back at dusk, and in the whole of that first year he never once stayed to sleep under a roof of hers, which was noticed by the Ferncross servants and reported to the Aldermore servants, and became, in the end, the single most respectable circumstance in the entire history of the family. What they did on those Sundays was walk. They walked the level, from the ridge to the outfall in sections, all through the spring and summer of 1820, with a survey and a notebook apiece, and generally Tom Ridd behind them with a measuring staff, because the act was in force now, and the works had 11 years to run, and the schedule was published, and there were 41 landowners on that catchment who could read it and would. She learned, in the course of those walks, that he had a memory for ground that was better than hers. He could stand at a gate and tell you the fall of the land to a foot by eye, which she could not do, and never could, having always to take a level and read it. He learned that when she said a thing was so, it was so, and that on the 3 occasions in 2 years when she turned out to be wrong, she said so first, out loud, before anybody else had noticed, and wrote the correction into the book with the date. And he told her once, in the August, on the bank above Cobb's, that this was the most frightening quality he had ever encountered in a human creature. And she said that it was not frightening at all, it was merely cheaper, because a mistake costs less on the day you find it than in any year afterwards. The accounts of the level were published every Michaelmas, as the Act required, in a printed sheet of 2 pages, and the 4th of them for the year 1822. Records that the works were then 3 years ahead of the 11-year schedule and £840 under the estimate, that the rate had been reduced twice, and that the acreage of drowned land upon the whole catchment had fallen from 1,160 acres in 1818 to 104. Copies of it went, at Adela's charge, to every commission of sewers in the south of England, to the Board of Agriculture, and to 4 gentlemen in Lincolnshire who wrote back. She was elected, in 1823, an honorary member of the Bath and West of England Society, which had been founded in 1777 and had never had a woman in it. And the minute recording the election is careful to describe her as the proprietor of the Aldermore estates and not as anybody's wife. because she had written to the secretary and asked for it in those words. They were married the second time on a Tuesday. It was not a wedding. There was nothing to marry. They had been married since 1813, and the deed of separation stood then, and stands in the box now, unaltered, word for word, as she had promised in front of a bishop. What happened was that on the 6th of June, 1821, the Duke of Wexbourne came to Ferncross on a Sunday and was not refused, and did not go back at dusk. And on the Tuesday following, the two of them walked down to Aldermore Magna Church at 8 in the morning with Mr. Fane and Mrs. Barrow and Lady Augusta and the schoolmistress and 31 girls. And the curate read the service of thanksgiving. And afterwards there was bread and cheese and ale in the great barn under the Queen Post roof of 1691 that had been paid for twice and never rebuilt, and the whole of it, from the church door to the last cart going home, cost £11 4 shillings, which is entered in the household book in her own hand under the heading sundries. She was 30. He was 8 and 30. They had 2 children, a daughter in 1822 and a son in 1824, and the daughter was taught bookkeeping by double entry at Ferncross School along with the tenants' girls, and could cast a rental at 11 years old, and the son, who succeeded as 8th Duke in 1851, is remembered chiefly for the Wexbourne Drainage Reports, 11 volumes, which he did not write, and which were published under his name because his mother, who did write 9 of them, said that they would be read that way and not the other, and that she was 70 years old and past minding. There is one more thing to be told, and it belongs to the summer of 1821, a fortnight after the bread and cheese in the barn, and it concerns the yellow drawing-room at Wexbourne House in Hanover Square, which had stood shut up under Holland covers for 3 years, because its owner had not been able to think of a use for it that did not turn her stomach. She opened it in the July. She had the covers off and the chandelier down and cleaned, and she ordered 24 candles, which was what it took, and had always been what it took, and she put in it a long table with 40 chairs, and the dinner she gave under those candles on the 11th of July, 1821, was for the 11 Brook tenants of Aldermore and their wives, brought up to London at her charge by post-chaise and relays over 3 days, together with Mr. Ephraim Marsh of Colebrook Street, aged 74, and his foreman Tapp, and Mr. Ambrose Pell, and Lady Isolde Verrell, and Lady Augusta Crail, and Sir Edmund Ray, and Sir Wilfrid Chase, and the Bishop of Elverton, whose nephew now had the living at Aldermore, and had earned it, and Tom Ridd, who was 22 and had a coat made for the occasion, and never afterwards wore it for anything else. Mrs. Prudence Barrow sat on the Duke's right hand at the head of the table, and told him for an hour and a half about the state of the Longmead hatch, and he listened to the whole of it, and had the hatch seen to in September. The Duchess of Wexbourne sat at the foot in plain white muslin with a band of grey ribbon, because she had never in her life been able to see the point of anything else, and she wore no jewels, and the Wexbourne rubies stayed in their case upstairs, where they remain. She left them by her will to the wives of the 11 Brook farms, to be sold and the money divided, which caused a great deal of trouble in 1868, and was done. Somebody counted the chairs at some point during the evening and found 40. They were not at equal distances. There had been a certain amount of moving them about, because Mr. Marsh was deaf on one side and Mrs. Barrow wished to be near enough to the Duke to finish about the hatch, and Tom Ridd had been shifted twice by his own request to get away from the bishop, and the Duchess of Wexbourne looked down the length of that crooked, noisy, unequal table under the 24 candles, at 44 people eating turbot in a room where a man had once explained that his wife was a piece of furniture, bought in Bristol and set down where it was wanted, and did not straighten a single chair. That is the whole of it, and the papers are all still there, in the deed box at Aldermore, for anyone who cares to look. The settlement of the 12th of October, 1813, with its proviso that was never performed, the schedule of 3 estates, the deed of separation, unaltered, with the ribbon still on it, the release of 1820 and the receipt for £29,640, the 3 marbled notebooks bought in Winchester for 2 and 9, the first of which begins on the 10th of April, 1818, with the words "I do not know," 61 letters about wool, 2 paragraphs cut out of newspapers with a penknife, and, at the bottom, in a wrapper marked in a clear round hand, the daybook of Marsh and Sons for the year 1814, open at the Alresford Turnpike, because Mr. Ephraim Marsh gave it to her at the door that night in July, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and said that a man must keep something, but that in his opinion she had better keep this one. She kept it for 47 years, and the Ridge Oaks are standing yet, 4,312 of them by the count of 1806, and rather more than 5,000 by the count of 1904, along the crown of the hill above 11 farms that have never once been under water since, and there is a stone at the top of the ride with nothing on it but a date, the 10th of February, 1818, which the tenants put up in 1869 after her funeral, having asked her son what they might put, and been told nothing. She would want the date and no words. She was always exact.